fantasy football.
There has never been a more obvious
There's a
sell.
huge edge to be gained by looking into things like this.
With the hype, it's only going one way. He's still too cheap.
How can you not love fantasy football?
Hello, welcome back. Part 2, technical issues curtailed part 1, but we are here to talk some Indianapolis Colts at the Carolina Panthers. Tom, Bryce Young not pushing the ball downfield, league low, 5.6% of his attempts are more than 20 yards downfield. Is that putting a break on this offense right now, or do you think that there's some glimmering lights that could be something more to come?
He's looked a bit better at times, definitely over the last couple of weeks. I think it's definitely not as bad as it looked early on in the season. I think now we're seeing Bryce Young has been a top 20 quarterback in the last 3 games he's played, which makes him at least usable in Superflex formats. I think when you're talking about the passing game, yeah, there's just absolutely nothing there apart from Adam Thielen. Chuba Hubbard is far more impressive right now than Miles Sanders, so at least the team have made that decision and they've gotten on with it so that things look like they'll progress there. You know, Chuba's had back-to-back games with 70% of the running back opportunities or more. Miles Sanders had been averaging 17.2 touches per game through the first 4, and that dropped all the way down to 2 total touches last week. So I'd feel much better about starting Chuba than I would anyone outside of Adam Thielen. On the Colts side of things, I think, you know, you look at what they're doing. They've allowed, on terms of defense, they've allowed 8.5 yards per reception to running backs, which isn't an area that Chuba Hubbard's been fantastic at, but it's an area that he's been, you know, okay in. So I think he could capitalize there. The Colts have allowed 5th most fantasy points to running backs, 2nd most running back rushing touchdowns per game at 1.4. The only team who allow more are the Panthers. So I'm interested in Zach Moss. I'm interested in Jonathan Taylor for this game. I think both of them could have good games. I'm not sure I'd try and get funky and start both of them in any sort of like DFS format, but I don't mind taking shots at Jonathan Taylor in particular this week.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Josh Downs this week? He seems to be creeping up in price every single week. He has been balling out since Gardner Minshew has been under center. Is he a guy that's hitting that point where he's getting a little bit too expensive to get into those lineups?
No, I think Josh Downs at 5,200 is completely fine. I think particularly against a team who, you know, the Panthers, we don't expect a lot from. What we've seen from the Colts is that they play fast. And when you play fast, there tends to be plenty of points to go around. The Panthers have allowed the 12th most fantasy points to wide receivers. They've allowed the 10th most wide receiver yards per game, 174. So I think that there's plenty of reasons why you can keep playing him. I think when you look at yards per reception, they've allowed the 9th most per game. So definitely no warning signs on Josh Downs. I think you can keep playing him. He's probably going to be quite popular. What I'd imagine is that Josh Downs is more popular than Michael Pittman, so I wouldn't mind actually playing Michael Pittman in tournaments to try to get a bit of leverage there.
Nice little hit. We touched on a little bit of Raiders talk earlier in the show, but obviously huge changes with the Raiders, new head coach, new offensive coordinator. Are we expecting them basically to get this offense right, or is losing the play caller and the offensive coordinator going to have a disastrous effect on this Raiders offense, do we think?
It says everything about the Giants, but the Raiders are actually favored in this game despite everything they've done. So I think if this was a tougher opposition, it would be possibly easier to kind of like say, okay, well, this isn't a week to start the Raiders, but Josh Jacobs should get going. We talked before about Aiden O'Connell's 1 start, Devontae Adams out targeting Jacoby Myers 13-4. So I think you can start Devontae Adams. I wouldn't be starting the likes of Michael Mayer. I probably wouldn't even be starting Jacoby Myers unless I had to. Josh Jacobs, sooner or later, he's going to get going. This feels like a team that, for now, They didn't want to trade him at the deadline. I don't know whether that was just due to incompetence or not, but apparently the Ravens were involved, but the Raiders wanted at least a second-round pick, so nothing materialized. But if you're going to hang on to Josh Jacobs, at least ride him whilst you're bringing in Aiden O'Connell, who looks okay, and by all accounts, the Raiders staff said that he's the running back who gives them the quarterback who gives them the best chance to win this season. So, yeah, I think on that side of things, it's fairly cut and dry. I mean, Aiden O'Connell is very cheap on DraftKings. You see there on screen, I've got it in front of me. Aiden O'Connell is 4,500, which probably brings him into consideration for DraftKings because it's rare you get a quarterback that cheap. On the other side of the ball, I mean, it's just miserable for the Giants. You look at it. Saquon's RB9, Waller was tight end 10, Jones QB 30. No Giants wide receiver has finished inside the top 20 any given week. Only 3 have finished inside the top 40 on a given week. There is nothing going on. We saw it last week when Waller left the game that the only plan is to give Saquon the ball. Saquon had 39 touches. No other player this year has had over 34. In 2022, there were only 2 instances where players had over 34 touches per game. But it didn't even really matter for Barkley last week. He only had 15.8 points. Hopefully this week he can get going because the Raiders aren't a tough defense against the run. You look at what they do. They rank 22nd against pass-catching running backs in DVOA. They've given up the 4th most fantasy points to position as a whole. And they're giving up the 3rd highest rushing yards per game to running backs at 120. So I'd like to think Saquon Barkley could have a good game this week. He is 7,900 on DraftKings, which might put people off. People will be preferring to play Kamara, but I think in tournaments there's some upside to try to play him.
Yeah, and the play you've not mentioned, Wan'Dale Robinson, I think I like the talent. I like the potential usage, but the ADOT is just criminal. You can see on screen there, 3.5 average depth of target. At that ADOT, he needs to be getting 8-9 targets a game to be a reliable option. Unfortunately, he's not getting that volume. And unless we start seeing some downfield targets, he's just not a startable option right now because the volume's not there and the high quality touches aren't there. So he's just a player you're basically having to stay away from, which is painful because the talent's there and the opportunity is absolutely there. Moving towards some of the bigger names, later evening games, we got Dallas at Philadelphia, obviously a massive divisional game. This feels like this could be the one that a lot of people are penciling in and targeting for those heavy stacks for that sort of tournament lineup.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the one which your eyes get drawn to it straight away. It's one of the higher over-unders of the slate, and it's not a particularly pretty slate. You look at what the Eagles do defensively. They allow the most wide receiver points per game, 46.5. The next nearest team is 42 points per game, so it's a big leap. They just haven't been able to stop players like they were last year. Last year, they were just stomping teams, and now their secondary just isn't capable of it at the minute. I think that CeeDee Lamb is absolutely set up for another big game. What we saw from him over the last couple of weeks has been fantastic. It's the kind of performances we wanted to see. He's been averaging 65 yards per game in his career against Philadelphia, but now this Eagles secondary allowing 91.4 yards per game to wide receiver ones. Lamb had 44 points last week, caught 12 of 14 targets, 158 yards, touchdown. The week before that, he was 7 of 7, caught every single target that week, and had 117 yards. So he seems to have kind of turned the corner slightly. I'd have every confidence in starting him. I think if you're looking for another wide receiver from the Cowboys, I'd be more tempted to start Michael Gallup than Brandon Cooks. It feels like that outside matchup is the one we want to be targeting. And then I like starting Jake Ferguson as well. The Eagles allow 4th highest catch rate to opposing tight ends, allowed 4th most touchdowns to the position at 0.5 per game. And we saw Ferguson last week of perfect 4 for 4, 47 yards and a touchdown. He was on the field constantly. I think he ran a route on 85% of dropbacks. So I like him. Tony Pollard, man, I mean, this one hurts. Like, Tony Pollard was so fun last year, but his efficiency is just way down. You can see on the screen 3.9 yards per carry versus 5.3 in 2022. They're running him up the gut more often, which isn't what you want to do with a player like Tony Pollard. You want to be bouncing him outside, letting him get that kind of speed under him. And then on the Eagles side, I mean, you just kind of start everyone, despite this being a tough matchup. Devonta Smith last week had 7 for 99 and a touchdown, first 20-point game since week 2. The Cowboys, they rank 4th best in DVOA versus wide receiver 1s, but 11th best versus wide receiver 2s. So their weakness is more the kind of Devonta Smith area of the game. AJ Brown, you're not benching a guy who's just put up 700 yards and 5 touchdowns in a month. And Dallas Goedert, I don't know, man. Like, I've got Dallas Goedert on my home team, and it's not been pretty. 2 top 12 performances all season. But when he gets going in this offense, it's going to be good, you'd imagine. He just seems to be not clicking quite the same way he did last year. And then lastly, in terms of the running backs, and you absolutely start DeAndre Swift. Gainwell had that red zone fumble last week, and then Nick Sirianni this week made a point of referring to Kenneth Gainwell as being the team's RB2. It's all set up for Swift, who, you know, isn't always looking incredible, but is doing more than enough to be your RB2 on an average team. So, yeah, pretty explosive one on paper. Hopefully it lives up to that.
Yeah, I think in your managed leagues, it's about trying to get as many of these guys in the lineup as possible. I think that over under could potentially get exciting and hopefully tick that over. I think the thing I wanted to touch on was the Dallas Cowboys' usage of their wide receivers. We've seen CeeDee Lamb throughout his career in Dallas be used heavily out of the slot as that kind of movable piece to get favorable matchups and be a high target volume. The last couple of weeks, that's changed. This last week, he saw the highest number of snaps out wide that he has so far this season. He is morphing into a true X receiver that's still going to get some slot snaps, still going to get that high volume touches and, option routes and force the ball down the seam. But he's being used outside, downfield, which is only going to be a good thing for his fantasy value. It does mean that Michael Gallup's natural role in the offense as that X-outside receiver is kind of dissipating. And I do wonder if we're going to maybe start to see someone like Jalen Tolbert. He had a season-high snap share last week. Is he going to start to get on the field and use that speed as another option? But, yeah, CeeDee Lamb, I think it's wheels up, and I think that he could have a phenomenal back end of the year this year and potentially be a league winner for people that invested that back-end first-round pick that in those redraft leagues we were hoping to. If you are watching this on record, not live, you can still get your questions in. Tom and I work through every single comment we receive. We will answer 100% of your questions, whether it be start sits, trade questions, dynasty questions, whatever you want, get them in. Tom and I will answer them throughout the week. Moving to the late games, Tom, the Damar Hamlin game, it feels like we're going to be talking about that for the next few days. I still can't get my head around why they've put this as an island game in the evening. I felt like they maybe should have buried it somewhere. But Buffalo at Cincinnati, could this be a really interesting, explosive one, or do you think this is going to be a defensive battle?
I think there's enough there for me to feel pretty interested in attacking this game aggressively in showdown slates. Normally I only play like 1 or 2 teams in showdown slates, but the Bills defense isn't good enough that we have to be worried about them at all. You mentioned earlier on how Jamar Chase is leading the league in targets and receptions right now. He's absolutely dominating with 12.1 targets per game. He's the only player over 11.3. So we know where the ball is going there. The Bills, their defense, like I mentioned, they're underperforming. They're banged up a little bit. They've not been fantastic all year. So I'd be starting Jamar Chase confidently as a captain in showdown. Dalton Kincaid is, though, really interesting because the Bengals ranked 29th against tight ends. We saw that with Dawson Knox out of the lineup, he's seen this jump to 19% target share. It's been very impressive. He looked like the player that they kind of wanted to get going. We saw him getting those kind of designed runs around the goal line, those kind of scheme touches, and it didn't quite work out, but he still found his way into the end zone. So I'd be very interested in starting Dalton Kincaid as a captain on showdown slates. I think if you've got James Cook, it's time to be worried. We've seen really disappointing usage over the last few weeks, kind of regressed at points. We saw Latavius Murray getting touches, and now you've got Leonard Fournette, who teams know can pass protect, teams know can be a short yardage kind of guy. And it just doesn't seem like that's something that they view James Cook as. He has 1 rushing touchdown, 15 red zone rush attempts. It's not what you want to see from a player when you feed the ball to him that many times. So it's tricky. On the other side of things, Joe Burrow absolutely looked back last week. I mean, we shouldn't have any questions about Joe Burrow going forward. Like, he just looks fantastic.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing I want to talk about is this Buffalo offense. It completely changed last week. Dawson Knox was injured. We saw them basically roll out 11 personnel, and the way they've used their wide receivers has completely switched. We saw Khalil Shakir get interested. If they're going to roll forward, he's got the chance to be fantasy relevant moving forward. But the biggest player it changed for was Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis's average depth of target so far this year: 18.8, 11.1, 26.8, 17.7, 14.5, 15.3. Last week, his average depth of target was 6.0, and he saw a season-high 12 targets. He's no longer just a pure deep threat. He saw high target volume used in interesting ways underneath, and that put out one of his best fantasy performances of the season. If he is going to be used in this way moving forward, he's suddenly not just the boom bust Gabe Davis that we always thought he was. He's suddenly a plug and play wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, and a really interesting player that you could potentially go out and buy right now before people realize that his usage has completely switched.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been a Gabe Davis fan for a little while. I think too many people held on to his performances last year and the fact that he played through a high ankle sprain and held it against him. And yes, his ADP did get a little bit nuts last year, but Gabe Davis, it's time to just embrace what we're seeing from him, and what we're seeing is very good.
Yeah, absolutely. The final matchup of the week, the game you all are here to hear us talk about. Of course, it's the Chargers against the phenomenal Zach Wilson-led New York Jets. Tom, is it just a case of don't start anyone in this game because it's going to be woeful?
I mean, as somebody who was a really big, aggressive drafter of Keenan Allen this offseason, it's been very disappointing to see him drop down to wide receiver 41 and wide receiver 30 in his last 2 performances. Justin Herbert, it just seems like he got back into his head and was doing the kind of things he did last week. He had 30 passes under 10 yards. And yes, he completed 27 of them, but he had the second lowest air yards per attempt of his career. And that's not what we want. We want to see him driving the ball downfield. And perhaps without Mike Williams and perhaps with Josh Palmer beat up, they felt like they just couldn't do that. But we need to see that from Justin Herbert. He's too good a quarterback to be having a dink and dunk quarterback like him. So hopefully they push it a little bit more this week. But yeah, we talked about it earlier in the first part of our preview. The Jets, they're a very good pass defense. Even despite everything that's been going on, they've been excellent. But they do allow the 8th most fantasy points to running backs through a run funnel. They don't allow points to wide receivers, but they do to running backs. So if I was playing a showdown game on this one, I'd probably be looking at Austin Eckler as captain. I think you can start Garrett Wilson with a reasonable level of confidence. Yes, it's not his ceiling, which we know he's capable of, but he is averaging 14 PPR points per game. It's up from like 8 PPR points per game that he got with Zach Wilson last year, so I'd be fine with him. And then Breece Hall, I mean, your boy Breece, you talked about it on Monday night on the Dynasty Rises and Fallers show. What Breece is doing right now is fantastic, and he deserves to be absolutely at the top of rankings constantly.
Yeah, I mean, 3 top 6 weeks on the trot, as you can see on screen there, 36% targets per run is absolutely wild. This Chargers defense is pretty woeful. They allow a lot of yards through the air, and I think that Breece Hall could be a movable chess piece, shall we say, for the Jets offense. The wide receivers for the LA Chargers, I think Keenan Allen's going to get his, but there's no way that I can enter Quentin Johnston or Josh Palmer if he's fit into a lineup. I think that the Jets are so good that they're not going to see the volume in order to make them fantasy relevant. So yeah, they're definitely low. The interesting guy I guess I want to touch on, Donald Parham. Do we have to talk about it? If Gerald Everett's injured, I feel like I say this every week, the Jets cannot cover tight ends at all. If Gerald Everett is injured, I know he's questionable at the moment, Donald Parham could be a really interesting kind of plug and play tight end. He's a bit touchdown boom bust, but if you need to go off the waiver wire or maybe an enabler in the showdown slate, maybe Donald Parham's the guy. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, Parham's an interesting player. Like I remember watching Parham in I think it was the XFL or the AAF, one of the two of them. But he flashes. They really seem to trust him in the red zone. He's had 4 touchdowns this year, which, if you gave 4 touchdowns to Kyle Pitts, we'd all be thinking of him quite differently. He's had 3 finishes inside the top 11, and it's no coincidence that all of those have come when he has scored touchdowns. Like, if you look at his yardage per week, he's had 0, 4, 7, 9, 19, 21, and 43. 43 coming last week without Gerald Everett in the lineup. So I don't think that he's somebody I'd be excited to play. But if you need somebody, if we get to games late and suddenly your tight end gets ruled out, you need to scrabble on waiver wires, that's probably somebody I'd be okay plugging and playing. But yeah, I think I just see the running backs and pretty much that's about it in this game, really.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. Well, that's it for this week. That is the slate. If you're watching this as part 2 and you've not watched part 1, we had a technical issue halfway through, so dive across, watch part 1. That's got all the big matchups, all those earlier games. But if you are watching, you've not hit the thumbs up, you've not hit that subscribe button, do that right now. And remember, if you still want your questions answered, we will answer 100% of your questions leading up to the games on Sunday. Get them in the comments below, and either Tom or I will give you an answer, whether that be redraft, DFS, Dynasty, whatever you want. We've got you covered. Keep it here, and we will be back very soon. Tom's got some DFS content coming for you before the weekend, and best of luck in your matchups.